For decades, Sally Field carried a secret so painful she couldn't speak about it. Burt Reynolds was Hollywood's biggest star, charming millions on screen. But behind closed doors, their relationship hid something darker. When Sally finally broke her silence in her memoir, it shocked everyone. She revealed the truth about control, manipulation, and heartbreak that nobody saw coming. This is the story of what really happened between two of Hollywood's most iconic stars, and why Sally waited so long to tell it. It was 1982 when Sally Field and Burt Reynolds met on the set of Best Friends. Sally was already famous from The Flying Nun and Norma Ray. But Burt Reynolds was different. He wasn't just an actor. He was a phenomenon. Every magazine had his face on the cover. Every woman in America seemed to want him. And somehow, impossibly, he wanted Sally. Their chemistry was electric. On screen and off screen, they couldn't keep their hands off each other. Hollywood insiders watched in fascination as one of the most powerful men in entertainment fell hard for Sally Field. She was talented, beautiful, and smart. But more importantly, she made him laugh. In interviews, Burt would gush about her. He'd tell stories about their time together with genuine warmth in his voice. For Sally, it felt like a fairy tale. She had worked her entire life to be taken seriously as an actress. Norma Ray had earned her an Oscar nomination. Suddenly, she wasn't just respected for her talent. She was also the woman dating Burt Reynolds. They became Hollywood's golden couple. Photographers followed them everywhere. Red carpet events turned into media circuses just to see them together. But nobody knew what was really happening behind closed doors. The relationship lasted 5 years. 5 years of what looked like the perfect romance. They went to parties together. They attended award shows together. Burt even bought a sprawling mansion in Hollywood, and Sally moved in. To the outside world, they had everything. Success, money, fame, and each other. Yet something wasn't right. Years later, when Sally finally decided to write her memoir, she would reveal that those 5 years weren't as perfect as they appeared. The man who charmed millions on camera had a completely different side. The control started small. Subtle comments about what she wore. Suggestions about which roles she should take. Gentle criticism wrapped in affection. But over time, it grew darker. But what happened next would take years of silence to finally come forward about. To understand what happened between Sally and Burt, you have to understand Hollywood in the 1980s. This wasn't like today. There was no #MeToo movement. There were no conversations about power dynamics in relationships. If a powerful man wanted to control his girlfriend, well, that was just how things worked. Nobody questioned it. Nobody talked about it. Burt Reynolds wasn't just famous. He was the most powerful man in Hollywood at that moment. In 1981, he was the #1 box office star in America. Not second. Not third. #1. He had the power to greenlight movies. He had the power to hire and fire people. He had the power to make or break careers with a single word. And he used that power everywhere, including in his relationship with Sally. What Sally would later describe wasn't abuse in the traditional sense that people understood back then. It was something more subtle and somehow more insidious. It was a man using his fame, his success, and his position to shape every aspect of her life. He didn't hit her. He didn't yell constantly. Instead, he controlled through influence. Through expectations. Through the weight of his enormous personality. Sally had spent her entire career fighting for respect. She had played a flying nun on television, and critics dismissed her. She had fought tooth and nail to be seen as a serious actress. Then she won an Oscar nomination. Finally, she was being taken seriously. But when she got together with Burt, something shifted. Suddenly, she wasn't Sally Field, the accomplished actress, anymore. She was Burt Reynolds' girlfriend. The roles she was offered started to change. Burt had opinions about which scripts she should read. He had thoughts about which directors she should work with. He would suggest that certain roles weren't right for her, that she should wait for something better. But what he really meant was that he didn't want her taking roles that would take her away from him. He didn't want her working with certain actors. He didn't want her becoming too independent. Few people knew the real reason Sally turned down certain projects during those years. What made it even more complicated was that Sally loved him. She genuinely did. When Burt was charming and affectionate, he was the most magnetic person in the world. He could make you feel like you were the only person who mattered. That's how he operated. The control came wrapped in love, in attention, in the promise of forever. It made it nearly impossible for Sally to recognize what was actually happening. But the situation would eventually become impossible to ignore. By the mid-1980s, the relationship had become something neither of them publicly acknowledged but both privately understood. The man who smiled for cameras and told charming stories about Sally in interviews was different when they were alone. He became possessive. He became jealous. He became demanding in ways that wore her down emotionally. Sally would later describe feeling like she was slowly disappearing. Her own opinions didn't matter. Her own dreams felt secondary. Everything revolved around Burt's career, Burt's schedule, Burt's needs. She found herself asking permission before making decisions. Not explicit permission, but the kind that comes from years of subtle conditioning. She learned which topics would upset him. She learned which friends he didn't want her seeing. She learned to make herself smaller to keep the peace. The control extended to her appearance. Burt had strong opinions about how she should look, what she should wear, how she should style her hair. In the beginning, it seemed like he just cared about her. But over time, it became clear he was trying to shape her into his ideal version of a woman. And if she didn't comply, there would be consequences. Cold silences. Angry outbursts behind closed doors that contradicted his public persona entirely. What made this particularly painful was that Sally couldn't talk to anyone about it. This was the 1980s. Women who complained about their famous boyfriends were seen as ungrateful or difficult. The narrative would have been that she was lucky to be with someone like Burt Reynolds. If she left him, she'd be the villain in the story, not him. So she stayed silent. She swallowed her pain. She kept smiling for the cameras. Friends noticed changes in her, but she couldn't explain. Her career had stalled in ways that seemed strange for an Oscar-nominated actress. She was taking fewer roles. She was appearing in fewer public events. When she did show up, she seemed quieter, less like herself. But when anyone asked if she was okay, she would lie and say everything was perfect. The truth was very different. What made this dynamic especially toxic was that Burt's behavior was inconsistent. One moment he could be loving and attentive, showering her with affection and gifts. The next moment he could be cold and critical, making her feel worthless. This unpredictability kept Sally constantly off balance. She never knew which version of Burt she would get. So she tried harder to be what he wanted, hoping that if she was perfect enough, if she was small enough, if she was quiet enough, he would go back to being the man she thought she loved. But eventually, even Sally's patience had limits. The end didn't come suddenly. It came slowly, like a relationship dying in increments. By 1987, 5 years into their relationship, Sally had reached a point where she couldn't recognize herself anymore. She looked in the mirror and saw a woman who had given up her own identity to fit into someone else's shadow. The realization was devastating. There was no single moment of explosive conflict that ended things, though there were many angry nights behind closed doors. Instead, there was a slow, creeping understanding that staying would mean losing herself completely. Sally began to realize that Burt's love came with a price tag she wasn't willing to pay anymore. The cost was her career, her friendships, her sense of self, and her future. What triggered the final break wasn't another fight or another act of control. It was a quiet moment of clarity. Sally was offered a role in a film that excited her. It was a substantial part in a movie directed by someone respected in the industry. For the first time in years, she felt that spark of ambition again. She wanted this role desperately. She deserved this role. But she knew what would happen if she told Burt about it. She told him anyway. His reaction was exactly what she expected. He didn't want her taking the role. He had reasons, of course. They always seemed reasonable when he explained them. The director was difficult to work with. The filming schedule would take her away for too long. The character wasn't right for her image. But underneath all of those reasons was the real one. He didn't want her having something that was just hers. He didn't want her being away from him. He didn't want her becoming more successful or more independent. Something shifted in Sally that night. She realized that she had been waiting for Burt to change, to become the man she thought he was when they first met. But he wasn't going to change. This was who he was. A man who needed to control the people around him. A man who used his power and charm as weapons. A man who couldn't handle a woman having her own ambitions. The truth stayed hidden for years, but the decision was made in that moment. Sally left. Not dramatically. Not with a huge public announcement. She simply ended the relationship and walked away. To the outside world, they had just drifted apart. Two famous people whose careers took them in different directions. That's what the tabloids said. That's what Burt told people. But the real reason was far more personal and far more painful. Yet what Sally didn't know was that her silence would haunt her for decades. After Sally left Burt Reynolds in 1987, she never publicly spoke about what really happened. For nearly 30 years, she kept the secret locked inside. Friends asked. Journalists asked. Biographers asked. But Sally always gave the same answer: it just didn't work out. We wanted different things. We grew apart. The standard Hollywood breakup narrative. Nobody pushed harder because nobody wanted to believe that Burt Reynolds, charming, funny, seemingly perfect Burt Reynolds, could be anything other than what he appeared to be. The silence wasn't just about protecting Burt's reputation. It was about protecting herself. In the 1980s and 1990s, if a woman spoke out about a powerful man's controlling behavior, she was labeled difficult, bitter, ungrateful. The narrative would have been twisted to make her look like she was the problem. Women who complained about famous men were seen as trying to profit off their fame or seeking revenge. Sally knew this. She had seen it happen to other women in Hollywood. There was also genuine fear involved. Burt Reynolds was still powerful. He still had influence. Speaking out could have damaged her career even further. It could have affected the roles she was offered, the directors who wanted to work with her, the way Hollywood treated her. The calculation was simple: staying silent was safer. Staying silent was easier. Staying silent was the price of peace. But staying silent also meant carrying the burden alone. For 3 decades, Sally lived with the weight of what she had experienced. She built a successful career despite the damage those 5 years had done. She won an Oscar for Places in the Heart in 1985, right in the middle of her relationship with Burt. She continued working, continued acting, continued proving herself as an artist. But internally, she was struggling with something she couldn't talk about. The pain manifested in different ways throughout her life. In her relationships with other men. In her self-worth. In her willingness to stand up for herself. She had learned, through her time with Burt, that love could be a weapon. That affection could mask control. That charm could hide cruelty. These lessons shaped how she moved through the world for decades. What made the silence even heavier was that Burt never acknowledged what had happened. He never apologized. He never seemed to understand the impact of his behavior. In interviews throughout the 1990s and 2000s, he would occasionally mention Sally with apparent fondness, seemingly oblivious to the pain he had caused. For Sally, this was its own form of gaslighting. It made her question whether her memories were even real. But in 2018, everything changed. In 2018, Sally Field published her memoir titled In Pieces. It was a book she had been working on for years, and it was deeply personal. She wrote about her childhood, her career, her relationships, and the moments that shaped her into who she became. But there was one relationship she had never publicly discussed in detail: Burt Reynolds. When readers opened the book and got to the sections about Burt, they found something they hadn't expected. Sally didn't hold back. She described the relationship with brutal honesty. She talked about the control. She talked about the manipulation. She talked about how a man she loved had systematically eroded her sense of self. The descriptions were painful to read because they were authentic. They came from a place of real hurt and real processing. What Sally revealed was that during their 5 years together, she had essentially stopped being an actress. Not officially. She was still taking roles. But she wasn't pursuing her career the way she had before. She wasn't fighting for the parts she wanted. She wasn't pushing herself creatively. Instead, she was trying to be the woman Burt Reynolds wanted her to be. And that woman was smaller, quieter, and less ambitious than the real Sally Field. She described how Burt would criticize her choices. How he would make her feel guilty for wanting to work. How he would use his position in Hollywood to subtly discourage her from taking certain roles. She talked about feeling trapped in a relationship where she couldn't win. If she focused on her career, he was upset. If she focused on him, she resented the loss of herself. It was an impossible situation, and she had stayed in it for 5 years. The memoir also revealed something unexpected. Sally didn't write the book to destroy Burt's legacy or to get revenge. She wrote it to heal. To process. To finally acknowledge what had happened so she could move forward completely. She wrote it because she had spent 30 years in silence, and that silence had cost her something precious: her own story. What shocked readers most wasn't just what Sally revealed. It was how clearly she articulated the psychology of control in relationships. She described the way small criticisms accumulate into something larger. The way love gets weaponized. The way a powerful person can make someone else feel small without ever raising their voice. Many women reading the book recognized their own experiences in Sally's words. Nobody expected Sally Field to finally break her silence after all these years. The response to the memoir was overwhelming. Women who had experienced similar situations in their own relationships reached out to Sally. They thanked her for speaking up. They said her honesty had helped them understand their own experiences. The book became a conversation starter about power dynamics in relationships, especially when one partner has significantly more power and influence than the other. But the revelation also came with unexpected consequences. When Sally Field's memoir came out in 2018, Burt Reynolds was still alive. He was 82 years old and had been largely out of the public eye for several years. The book's revelations put him in a difficult position. For decades, he had maintained the narrative that his relationship with Sally had simply run its course. Now, suddenly, the world was hearing a very different story. Burt's response was notably quiet. He didn't give extensive interviews defending himself. He didn't attack Sally's credibility. He didn't deny what she had written. Instead, he seemed to accept it with a kind of resignation. In one of his last interviews before his death in September 2018, just months after Sally's memoir was published, he was asked about their relationship. He acknowledged that he hadn't been perfect. He said he regretted some things. It wasn't a full apology, but it was something. What many people didn't realize was that Sally's decision to finally speak up had ripple effects far beyond just her own healing. Her memoir came at a crucial moment in Hollywood history. The #MeToo movement had just exploded. Women were finally feeling empowered to speak about their experiences with powerful men. Sally's book, though written before #MeToo became a cultural phenomenon, fit perfectly into this conversation about power, control, and accountability. For Sally herself, the act of writing the memoir and sharing her truth was transformative. She described it as finally reclaiming her own narrative. For 30 years, she had let Burt's version of events be the public story. Now, at last, her version mattered. Her experience was valid. Her pain was real. And she didn't have to apologize for any of it. The memoir also changed how people understood Sally's career during the 1980s. Her relative absence from major film roles during those years wasn't a mystery anymore. It wasn't because she had lost her talent or her drive. It was because she had been in a relationship that demanded her energy, her attention, and her sense of self. Understanding this context, people began to appreciate her career differently. They saw the resilience in the fact that she had continued working at all, even while struggling with control and manipulation. In the years after the memoir's publication, Sally became an unexpected voice for survivors of emotional abuse and control in relationships. She didn't set out to be this person. She simply told her story, and people responded. Women who had felt alone in their experiences suddenly felt seen. The conversation about what constitutes abuse expanded beyond just physical violence to include the subtle, psychological forms of control that Sally had experienced. Burt Reynolds died on September 6, 2018, just a few months after Sally's memoir was published. He never had to sit with the full weight of public judgment or extensive media scrutiny about what Sally had revealed. Some people felt that was fitting. Others felt it meant there was never true accountability. But Sally moved forward regardless. She had finally told her truth, and nothing could change that. What Sally's story ultimately teaches us is the power of silence breaking. For 3 decades, she carried a secret that affected how she moved through the world. When she finally spoke, it wasn't just her own healing that mattered. It was the healing she offered to countless other people who recognized their own stories in hers. Sometimes the most courageous thing a person can do is simply tell the truth about what happened to them. But this story isn't the only time Hollywood's darkest secrets have finally come to light. The next story on this channel reveals another shocking revelation about a beloved actor that changed everything we thought we knew about them.